So what do I search for at youtube.com?
You go to the Warren Redlick YouTube channel, and it should be live right now.
Okay.
Hello, this is Warren Redlick. I'm here with my friend Chris Walcek. Am I pronouncing it right, Chris? Walcek?
Yes, that's good. There has been debate about whether it's Walcek or Walcek, but Walcek is okay.
Okay, so Chris and I have been friends for probably 20 years. We met in something called the Schenectady Torch Club. And we share a common interest in critical thinking, a common interest in science, a common interest in really being positive about the way the world is going. And Chris is a scientist. He is a research scientist at, I would say his specialty is atmospheric science, and he's at the University of Albany, but I'll let him explain a little bit more what his specialty is.
Yeah, no, I'm an atmospheric scientist. I graduated with a degree in cloud physics from UCLA back in 1983. I've been doing work in air pollution research and cloud physics since then, and it's been a very fun career. I love science.
Awesome. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about, and by the way, Chris, are you now seeing it on YouTube?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Well,
So
wait a minute. Yeah, let me click on it here. Okay, there. Okay, I made it bigger now.
so we're probably lagging a bit, right?
It's loading. There it is. Okay.
Okay. So, and I don't know if I think I may have to load this myself. I see that there's viewers. Let me try. I'm sorry for those who are watching. I'm learning on the job here. So I want to thank Chris for being my experiment. Uh,
I had to
okay.
close it down, Warren. The lag was bigger than 10 seconds, and
I
then
think
it
it's
was
20.
doubling. Well, it was doubling over with what you were saying. So I'm just going to leave it off. But I just wanted to see what it looked like.
Okay. So, hi, Mike. Thank you for your comment. Thank you for everything. I am trying to figure out how to see the chat stream while I'm watching, and so far I've got a message on my YouTube studio that I'm unable to connect to the chats. I don't know why that is, but I can see it on the. I'll check the YouTube channel from time to time to see what's going on, to see what chat comments are. Anyway, so Chris, I wanted to talk to you about a bunch of things. The first thing, because of as we discussed off air before we were live, the audience that I have on this YouTube channel is very interested in electric vehicles and the prospect of self-driving cars. And I wanted to hear what you think about that prospect that we're going to have a world of self-driving cars. People in the community believe that electric vehicles are less polluting than internal combustion engine vehicles. And then on top of that, you have that robotaxis will be on the road more. So if you take a vehicle that it took however much energy to produce and it lasts 150,000 miles, if a robotaxi takes less to produce and lasts for 1,000,000 miles, then you're doing less damage to the environment by using electric vehicle robotaxis. What do you think about all that?
No, the biggest issue that I have, most people think, well, an electric car, doesn't emit any pollution, and that's exactly right. But I like to call an electric car, it's an emission elsewhere vehicle. There is still pollution produced in making the electricity today for it. And then with any system like that, like an electric car system, you have to look at the whole life cycle, total economic picture there. Producing an electric car is more expensive than producing a gas car today. The fuels are quite a bit cheaper. Natural gas and coal are on a per joule basis quite a bit cheaper than oil. And then you can burn them more efficiently in a power plant than in a small internal combustion engine. So, but to me, it's not the bottom line. I've always said that your total carbon environmental impact is very much related to the cost. And if you can bring costs down, you truly are benefiting the environment. And to me, I know you've tried to convince me that an electric car, a $50,000, $60,000 electric car, is more economical than my $15,000 or $20,000 Elantra, and I'm not sold on that yet. I don't. Now, if it'll last 10 times as long, you got me. If it'll last, if there's a lot less maintenance on it, yes, you can do things, and if you can run it more often, my car is only, I calculated that in our run up to our conversation here. My car is only running for 3 weeks out of a 52-week year. And if you could run that car twice as much, you'll reduce the cost by a factor of 2. And so anything that goes in that direction will make it more cost effective. It'll make people want to make the jump from their personal car, and it'll be good for the environment.
Okay, just one step back. I think when we first started talking about this, the typical electric vehicle was $50,000 or $60,000 or more. The Tesla Model Y is now in the ballpark of, I think you're looking at 40,000 at the low end, and I think that price is going to get lower. Especially one of the things Elon Musk likes to talk about is in a robotaxi world, you delete parts. You don't need a steering wheel. You don't need brake pedals, and there's a lot of things you may be able to take out that will make the cost of manufacture less. So,
yes.
Elon says, the cost to Tesla of making a Tesla Model 3 or Model Y is probably less than $35,000.
And then you have to compare that with the same numbers for a Hyundai Elantra or an Accent or a Honda Civic, and so that's the cost difference that you have to really compare there. But anyway, my issue, I've often thought that the defining technology that has transformed civilization as we know it and the world economy was the personal automobile of the 20th century. Okay? Roman soldiers were buried with their chariots. Okay? There's something about, holding on to 100 horses worth of power and moving you down the road. And that's what the car has appealed to in humanity. They've given you control, personal control. And how many people, feel safe in their own car, but they don't feel safe flying an airplane? Anyway, there's something about being in control that people like. And that would be my biggest cloud around this picture of, if you want me to give up my car and you want me to just snap my fingers and a robo electric car shows up at my door in 5 minutes and takes me where I want to go, I'm not in control anymore. And I don't know, you maybe can change the human spirit, but I don't know, maybe we're too married to the car culture right now, but I'm not, but it could change.
So I think the answer to that is, in the short term, you're right. A lot of people will cling to their God and their guns and their cars. But the practical reality is, if it saves people money and if it's more convenient. So I guess one of my favorite examples of this is, if you ever gone to Disney World and you've stayed in a hotel off-site and then you go to visit Disney World, you park in this monstrous parking structure, then you walk like a half a mile to get into Disney. And you compare that to, you take a Robotaxi and it drops you off at the front door. And when you come out, you don't have to figure out, where did I park?
Right.
The Robotaxi comes and picks you up. So you never go to a gas station again because the Robotaxi charges while you're not there. You don't. I foresee. So the future, we already have the future here to accept right now with Uber and Lyft. With Uber and Lyft, a ride costs you about $2 a mile, and your car costs you about 60 cents a mile. Now, a lot of people are choosing not to own a car, and they're choosing, like, I have a family member who doesn't own a car and exclusively takes, I don't know whether it's Uber or Lyft or switches, and she's perfectly happy, has no desire to own a car. And I think that when you lower the cost of the alternative to owning your own car, and I think in the short run, in the very early days of a robotaxi world, I think it's going to be $1 a mile. I think that's what Elon Musk has talked about, as his goal is $1 a mile. At $1 a mile, okay, that's still more expensive than owning your own car if you drive a lot and you value owning your own car. But I don't think it's that far down the road. And I mean 2 or 3 years after it comes out that you're going to talk about 50 cents a mile, and it's actually going to be cheaper. And then you have some people, it's more expensive per mile. If you have 2 drunk driving arrests on your record and you drive a $50,000 Mercedes, your cost per mile is much higher than the guy driving a Hyundai Elantra with a clean driving record in Albany versus someplace with higher insurance rates. So the idea is that it gradually spreads, and it's adopted first by people for whom the cost of owning your own car is high.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. To me, the cost, the biggest thing is going to be the cost. That is going to be the necessary ingredient, and then you're going to have to go beyond that. Even it's got to look sexy. There's got to be something. But the cost is the minimum necessary You have to give me something. For me, I'm a tightwad all the way. I inherited that from my Depression era mother, who, cut my own hair and did all kinds of stuff like that. And to me, that's has to be the ingredient. Tesla right now so far the model of Tesla is it's doing the Apple iPhone. People are paying a premium because it makes them look wealthy, but so they're actually willing to pay more per mile for that electric car because of the prestige boost that you get, and so they're willing to do that, and that works for a good segment of the population. And I'm pretty sure the automobile itself, back in the early 1900s, had the same. A car was probably more expensive to run than a horse back in 1901.
Right.
And yet it was the rich people that got the cars. And by the way, there was a very healthy electric car industry. There used to be an electric car manufacturers association back in the early 1900s, and there was healthy competition between electric cars and gasoline-powered cars. And eventually, for every improvement in the electric car that happened in the early 1900s, there was an equal and even better improvement in the internal combustion. And eventually, the electric car lost the race there, technologically and cost-wise.
They just didn't have the battery technology at the time.
That's right.
They couldn't
That's
get the batteries to improve fast enough.
That's right. No, and still today, I would argue that for personal car usage, the battery it still is a negative. The ability to get 500 miles on a 5-minute refueling time that's going to be hard to do in an electric car for quite a while here. And
just really briefly on that, one thing is I want to thank Mike Hale for his comment. Mike says, "I'm in control when I tell the app where I want to go." I don't need the immediate steering control. I tell the car, when you walk in an elevator, you don't control how the elevator gets you from floor to floor. You say, "I want to go to the 5th floor," and it goes.
That's fair.
So,
that's fair.
So as far as range, that is one of the most common concerns people have about an electric vehicle. The reality is that most of us, most of the time, do not drive more than 100 miles a day.
That's right.
And right now, Teslas are typically achieving 300 plus miles of range for a lot of their line now. The Tesla Model S is supposedly at 400 miles of range, and I think we're looking at 500 miles of range soon. So if in your daily drive you don't go more than 300 miles, you're okay. And the big plus here is you drive into your garage and you plug in and you charge, or you get to your destination. Let's say I drive up to Orlando and I go stay in some hotel in Orlando. I plug in the car at the destination. I never have to stop at a gas station. It's actually saving me time. Now, the only difference is if I drive somewhere farther, like Tallahassee. I'm thinking, here I am in Florida, or if you're in Schenectady and you're driving to Baltimore. If you're just going to New York City, I think 300 miles covers it easily.
Maybe not in winter though, but anyway, if I'm running your heater and it's cold, anyway, there are things that.
The Model Y has a new heat pump. That's a whole other conversation. They made that a lot more efficient. But if you're going somewhere farther, yes, you have to stop once maybe, and that takes you an extra 20 minutes or 25 minutes. But offset that with all the days where you were driving less than a few hundred miles, and you just charged in your garage, came out in the morning, and you were at a full charge or at 80%, depending on how you're charging your vehicle. You might go months without going to a gas station or a charging station. So I think that's a huge plus. Chris said something. I was going to go to that, Chris Anderson, thank you. You said the car has to look sexy or be good or hot or whatever, and that's true when you're buying your car. But when people are summoning an Uber or Lyft, they don't care whether it's a Honda Accord or a Ferrari. I'd probably rather go for a ride in a Ferrari, but nobody's driving Ferraris for Uber. So I think that the need for the car to be cool vanishes in a robotaxi world. And my extreme future is a world of hyper-efficient robotaxis that maybe only carry one passenger, because the vast majority of rides are single passenger. And you may be able to get down to a cost to the owner of the vehicle of 5 cents a mile. And if you get down to a cost of 5 cents a mile in an efficient network that routes wisely, it may cost the user 10 or 15 cents a mile, which is a dramatic drop from.
So that's a robo motorcycle.
My vision of it still has 4 wheels. It's just only 3 feet wide.
Yeah.
And smaller, weighs less, costs less to manufacture. It doesn't even have windows. It just has a nice screen inside, and you can watch the outside from the car's cameras if you want, or you can play video games or watch a movie while you're riding in it. How long because it may be less expensive to manufacture the car without windows. I don't know. I think it would be less expensive to manufacture the car without windows. That's an interesting question. I would assume it would be less expensive, but we'll see. So,
No,
go ahead. Go ahead.
go ahead. Oh no, what I was going to say is I think you have to temper this a little bit with. See, one thing the way my family works is we take an annual vacation, 350 miles to the Delaware shore. Okay, and okay, are you going to do that in that robo future? I load up the kids, load up the ice chests, load up the beach umbrellas, and I need my minivan for that. Now, if I'm going to buy a minivan anyway, and it's sitting in my garage to take me to the beach once a year, I'm then tempted to use it for everything else. And so that's another factor, I think, that, I like your future of nobody owning a car anymore, but I still don't think you're going to fulfill every niche reason why people buy cars or why they use cars. They're going to have to haul lumber from a woodlot. I don't know. There's just a lot of things that are not going to be amenable to a robo car.
I think so. I think Cybertruck covers a lot of that. Cybertruck is going to seat 6 people, and it's going to have a huge bay. It's going to hold more than your minivan's going to hold. It seems likely to me that they will come up with larger vehicles for purposes like that, and that's just sort of a down the road thing. For me, the key is the vast majority of trips that are on the road today are single person in the car going from point A to point B, and if we knock that off, so I wanted to ask you about that then. What's the environmental impact? Let's say, I'm going to make up a number. Let's say there's 100 million cars in America today. It could be 50 million, it could be 200 million, I don't know. But let's say there's
150 million.
Okay, so let's say there's 150 million cars on the road.
One car for every 2 people.
Okay, so let's say you replace 50 million cars with 10 million robotaxis. Can you ballpark or in your head estimate what's the environmental impact of that? How much less CO2 does it put out? For the folks who are interested, we're going to talk about climate change at the end of this conversation, or towards the end of this conversation. I wanted to talk about EVs first, but do you have a sense about what the reduction in pollution would be by taking 40 million ICE cars off the road, replacing them with 10 million EVs?
No, the biggest factor, this is a very, very complicated question, and it would require a full life cycle. The question, how much is it saving right now versus over the lifetime of the car? And, there's a whole bunch of questions there that you have to clarify that. But the biggest factor in calculating the impact of the transportation sector on our carbon emissions is just the vehicle passenger miles traveled. Okay, and so if you're not cutting trips, you're probably not cutting the impact as big as you think you are. So just taking cars off the roads. If you're putting more people in the current, right now there's 150 million registered cars on the road in the United States. If you cut that down to 100 million and you're transporting the same number of people, then you're being more efficient per passenger mile. And so to me, the way I would calculate that, I would look at the cost per mile, the number that you've been calculating for us there. And if you can show that the cost per mile is lower for your system than the cost per mile of the car, there's an interesting conversion factor in the global climate change. It has to do with we talk about the social costs of carbon, but there's a social benefit of carbon, and it's the correlation between carbon emissions from fossil fuels and the gross domestic product, the economic activity. And you go from the poorest countries of the world to the richest countries of the world, and here's a number worth remembering. Every pound of CO2 that is emitted per person or per country translates to $1 worth of GDP economic activity. Dollar per pound.
Per capita.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's $1 per pound of CO2. Okay. It doesn't matter if I burn a pound today, I'm going to put I do $1's worth of economic activity. And but anyway, so to me, you have to show a savings. You have to show if I have cut the amount of dollars that I'm spending on something, then I have cut my carbon by exactly the amount of the dollars that I've saved. That's just I call it a carbon app. It's like you can calculate your carbon impact by your consumption of dollars. And $1 a cup of coffee at McDonald's, it does half the carbon as $1 or a $4 cup at Starbucks. It's a very cute conversion factor there. Okay. So anyway, if you can And in fact, I've done an interesting study. I remember getting in a debate with everybody tells you to buy local, with farmers markets
Yeah.
and things, and you can actually show that shipping an apple from Washington State to New York in a 80,000 pound 18-wheeler, that's 60,000 pounds of apples. That's actually more efficient than driving your minivan 10 miles to a farmer's market to pick it off a tree. You're actually putting more carbon with that one apple than if you got it off the truck coming from Washington. Why? Because the truck is a way more efficient way of transporting things than your minivan, where you're putting maybe 10 pounds of apples in a 4,000-pound car. Anyway, so the same applies with the consumer transportation market. Right now, I get in my car by myself. It's a 3,000-pound car, 4,000-pound car, and I'm a lousy 200 pounds, not even, okay? And if you can double the number of passengers in that car, you've kind of doubled the efficiency. So if we can pack more people into cars, you're guaranteed to be doing a benefit to the environment.
Okay. So, what was the next thing I wanted to talk to you about? Rocket launches, because Chris or Dr. Walcek is a research scientist with so much experience in atmospheric science, and we talked about this before we went live. SpaceX is launching rockets into space. There is an expectation among enthusiasts like me that SpaceX will soon be launching a lot of rockets into space, like maybe 1,000 launches a year or more. Starship,
3 a day.
Starship, yes, 3 a day. They fly up. They literally fly up, come back down, and launch again 3 times a day. Well, we've seen them land. We've seen them land.
Yeah.
And in theory, it flies up, it flies back down. It needs basically no rehab. It refuels and it goes back up again. That's the fantasy.
Just like an airplane at the airport. Yeah.
I think there's a trick where it flies up. I think it has to orbit a couple times to get back into position so that it'll land in the right spot. Because the way they orbit, it's not orbiting directly above the spot where it is. It has to get back so that when it re-enters, it will land where it needs to land. But it should be able to, in theory, launch multiple times a day. So the question I had for you, though, was what is the impact of rocket launches? And I should say, I believe they're going to be fueled by methane and oxygen is the planned the fuel for the SpaceX's ship's rocket that they're developing is called Starship. It uses an engine called the Raptor, and the Raptor runs on methane. The reason for that, by the way, is so that when they get, or a principal reason for that is when they get to Mars, they will be able to manufacture methane from water using the Sabatier process. They'll be able to produce methane, and I believe it's methane and oxygen from the Sabatier process using solar power.
So I assume that's a liquid methane.
Yes, it's actually cryogenically cooled methane, so that they can compress more of it in the tank, so it holds more fuel. They're testing this right now. I think today they're testing the cryogenic storage, and they may be about to do a static fire of Starship number 4, which is still a prototype. Starship number 5 is the one that may go into orbit, and they're building Starship number 5 now. So what's your thoughts on methane-powered rockets launching into space and what impact they will have on the atmosphere, CO2, ozone layer? What kind of impact do you see that having?
No, I wish. I worked with a colleague of mine at the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center he actually had NASA contracts to study the environmental impacts of the shuttle plumes. And they were going down and measuring I don't know they use chlorine fuels, and there were some very strange compounds that were injected into the atmosphere that I think had some deleterious effects, especially up in the stratosphere. They were worried about a lot of the ozone hole issues high in the stratosphere. And I'm not an expert in that area, but I do remember hearing there's a lot of very toxic sounding metal containing compounds in rocket exhausts. Some of the solid fuel rockets have I don't know what the fuel is. I don't know the mechanics of that, but there was something about that. But now here's my immediate observation. Rocket plumes are really tiny. I mean, they're 10 feet wide, 50, 100 feet wide. That's a needle in a haystack kind of an effect. And I don't even think at the levels you're talking about. The atmosphere is a big place, and you by punching a little, the equivalent of that's the equivalent of a little, needle hole through the atmosphere, and then the whole Earth is turning and the air is spinning. And my immediate reaction is that doesn't sound like it would have. It reminds me of the effects of contrails, and there's a lot of people that are, these chemtrail conspiracy people that think that these jet contrails are, changing the world. But everything I've seen on the effect of jet exhaust is that these are down in the noise level, way below anything that has a huge impact on the worldwide environment.
Yeah,
it does have local effects. You maybe don't want to fly right through the plume right after it happens, but I don't think there's going to be a big impact on the long range, and it's just a volume issue.
I don't think there's any significant chemicals and I don't know about the current rocket, which is called Falcon 9, uses the Merlin engine. I believe that's a different fuel structure, so it might be jet fuel. I'm not sure exactly what it's using. I know it's RP.
Saturn V was a kerosene engine.
I think it's something like kerosene now. But the Starship is moving to methane. I believe that would probably have less bad stuff in it. Might have more CO2. The other thing is, and I realized I wanted to talk to you about solar in a minute, because in theory they're going to produce the methane on site with solar panels. So they're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere in order to make the methane, so it would be effectively carbon neutral. So, no, but one of the things you said about the atmosphere being really big, the plume is only so big and the atmosphere is really big, that comes up a lot for SpaceX talk when it comes to Starlink. SpaceX is launching a network of satellites that will serve as an internet provider. You put a pizza box size satellite dish on your house, and that you'll be able to get really, really high-speed internet, much higher speed than what we're used to, at a reasonable price. But people are concerned, well, they're going to launch 42,000 satellites. Oh, they're going to run into each other. It's going to crowd space. Like, space is really big.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Space is really, really big. And, it's not like they're all at one level. You think about the surface of the Earth, and we have all these cars on the surface of the Earth, and that's not really a huge problem. Well, now you imagine if you have space, and you have multiple levels of orbits. They're not all in the same orbit. So it's basically three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional, or multiple layers. So it's something called there's a fear that satellites are going to crash into each other. It's going to create a big debris problem, and there's a term for it, the something syndrome or something like that would make space unusable. And also the Starlink satellites are in a low orbit, so their orbits naturally decay. That's a long conversation. Anyway, I want to ask you about solar next. Tesla is building out a big thing with solar panels. Their current product, which is built in Buffalo, not far from you, is the solar roof product. And the solar roof product will basically, when you have to put a new roof on your house or you're building a new house, instead of just building with a regular roof and then putting solar panels on top of it, you build a roof out of solar tiles. And it may cost a little bit more than a regular tile roof, depending on, some roofs that people put on are expensive anyway. But it's supposedly more durable the way they're building it, but it's going to generate electricity. You put a Tesla Powerwall battery in your garage, or a couple of Powerwalls in your garage, and this will make you'll be producing electricity from solar, and I think they're now producing, or they're able to produce 1,000 roofs a week. And when you spread that out, Kessler syndrome, thank you, Thaddeus. The space thing with too many satellites is called the Kessler syndrome, when they crash and they create debris. Thank you, Thaddeus. What do you think about the prospects for solar? I know you've been concerned that solar is expensive and it doesn't really work out in cost per kilowatt hour, but if you integrate it with the roof and you're able to produce it at roughly the same or a slightly more expensive cost of the roof, at some point does solar become a better way of generating electricity than natural gas or whatever the other alternatives are?
I think, that's a complicated question. There is in our research center, there's a renewable energy group, and the latest approach that putting something on a roof, that's a distributed source, and it's just very one of the big problems that solar has cost-wise is the installation costs, and for the same amount of money, the cost to install it on your roof is about 5 to 10 times higher than installing it in a solar farm. Go into a field. You don't need to climb up and break your neck on someone's roof, and you can build by the way, when you put it on your roof, you need an AC/DC transformer there, and so you're putting, my roof, I can maybe put 4 kilowatts of solar on it, but I need to buy a transformer. Now, boy, when you go to a solar farm, I can put 10 or 20 or even 100 times that amount and have just one transformer converting AC to DC to AC. And so anyway, but community solar, this idea of where the solar panel sits doesn't matter in terms of getting solar into the power grid. And it's just much more cost effective to put those same solar panels in a field or a farm somewhere than it is to put it on your roof. And so it's probably, I could see if you were out in the middle of the Adirondacks, or do you have wilderness areas in the Everglades in Florida where you're off the grid? I could see that as a niche application for what you're describing. But even there, you're going to have problems with 24/7. You need to be on the grid anyway. And so if you need to be on the grid for solar to get the 24/7, 365, on-demand power, it's probably just much more cost-effective. And again, I'll go back to cost. It's, if you can bring the cost down, you save the carbon footprint of making that infrastructure.
Okay, but on the cost side, when you talk about putting it on the roof, keep in mind that there's a lot of people replacing the roofs anyway. So if the cost of it, if you're replacing your roof anyway, and instead of replacing it with concrete tiles or whatever, tiles that people are using now or asphalt, if you replace it with a solar roof, the cost of asphalt might be the same or close.
Well, no, but there you got to, well, again, if you could, well, again, I'm just looking at it purely from the solar. You're right. I'm going to have, my roof it's a 25-year-old roof, and I got to maybe replace it on my roof right now. And if you gave me an estimate right now of, okay, I'm going to send roofers up there, it's going to cost me $20,000 to put the new roof on. What's it going to cost me extra if I convert those to solar panel roofs? That's the cost that you want to compare. And my guess would be I would have to actually do the hard details there. If I took that same incremental cost of adding it to my existing roof versus buying solar panels, because I'm pretty sure solar panels that aren't roof tiles are cheaper than solar panels that are roof tiles.
Oh yeah.
I think you could get cheaper. You could get cheaper solar panels, and you would get more kilowatt hours putting those that money that you would put into your roof, put it into a community solar farm a mile away.
The cost of solar tile is less than the cost of roof plus panel. The idea.
Well, no, but again, that's not the comparison you want to make. You want to make the comparison of I want a kilowatt of electricity or a kilowatt of solar installed capacity. What's that cost? And that's what we're comparing here. And again, you can put it on your roof, but I'm just saying you're going to get more kilowatt hours if you put that same dollars into a solar farm down the street, a mile away.
Well, that depends on how efficient they are at making solar roof tiles, because if the cost of the solar roof tile is the same or less than the cost of the roof tile you were going to put on anyway, plus the panel itself.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, no. Well, there you're thinking pie in the sky, Warren. Yes, if free solar panels, yeah, there's no question that.
I'm saying.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is you're kind of dreaming here. If you claim I can buy a tar tile or I can have a tile that's going to be cheaper than a tar shingle.
Yeah, no. Let me be clear. So I live in a community where you can't use those. There are a lot of communities in the country where you have to put in more expensive roofs. For those who don't know, I used to live near Chris, and I had an asphalt roof in my old house, and asphalt roofs were common in our neighborhood, and I think they're common in your neighborhood. Chris lives, I believe, in Niskayuna? Latham, New York. Okay, and I lived in Guilderland, New York, and the Albany, New York area is mostly asphalt tile roofs. Here in Florida, all the roofs in my neighborhood are not asphalt tile. They're not asphalt. They're all concrete tiles or some. It's very expensive to replace a roof here. It's I think that's that's an environmental. That I grew up in California where it's all shake wood. I remember when I was a kid, it was wood roofs. But there's a. Well, that again, I would look at the cost. If you can show me it's more cost effective, then, and again, the comparison I want you to make is with right now going out to a solar farm, a community solar farm in your area, and they've got 100 megawatts or they've got hundreds of kilowatts of installed capacity
putting the same wattage of solar panels on that community farm, that's the cost you want to compare
so
it
then,
with.
Getting to the other question, which is, okay, let's suppose I'm going to do a solar farm. How does that compare cost-wise with other forms of energy? Are solar farms still significantly more expensive per kilowatt hour than natural gas?
That's a big debatable thing. I've seen. I think when. Well, by the way, you can't just even compare the cost, because a big issue was if you have or if you're relying on solar energy, you still need that fossil the what's called dispatchable power. You need a power plant that you can turn on, or you can put the pedal to the metal and make it run a little faster and slower in order to have electricity 24/7. So when you compare the cost of solar, you have to factor in that intermittency factor of, basically you're still going to need a power plant there. And even if the solar generated all of the power for your grid, and this applies to wind and any of the intermittent energy sources, you're still going to need that backup to turn on when the wind is not blowing or when the sun is not shining, or you have to install batteries, which are another expense. So it's very difficult to compare. But and I'm biased here. I've tended to look at and believe the studies that show that solar is quite a bit more expensive than it's quite well. It's funny, in our research group we have wind energy people, because that's meteorology, but solar energy is meteorology too. You have clouds, and a lot of meteorological factors affect how much sunlight makes it to the ground. In fact, all of weather is driven by sunlight. So the same physics that goes into predicting the weather goes into predicting how much sunlight you're going to get. But all of the studies I've seen show that solar is significantly more expensive on a per kilowatt basis of electricity than wind is. And the studies that I've seen on wind show that it maybe can be competitive in some markets with fossil fuel, with combined cycle natural gas, which right now is one of the cheapest.
Okay.
But that could change if the price of fuel changed. Heck, even right now, you could probably run diesel generators at $1 a gallon for diesel. I'm not sure what price gases are in your area, but with the price of fuels plummeting right now, I have a feeling the answer to your question is going to change from week to week.
Okay, I didn't prep you for this beforehand, but Tesla does have a battery business called Tesla Energy Storage. They have something called, what is it, Power Pack and Mega Pack, and they're working on installations.
No, I'm very familiar with that.
They installed a battery pack in Australia. I believe it's called the Hornsdale Power Reserve, and it ended up being more cost effective for Australia and better in terms of just smoothing the energy flow than peaker plant. What happens is when there's a sudden spike in demand for energy, or there's a sudden loss in supply, then peaker plants come online, and the peaker plants tend to be the least efficient source of energy for the fossil fuel world. The battery pack, it turns out, so far at least, it saved money, and it was smoother. It replaced the energy almost instantly. So there is hope for that. Yeah, Chris Anderson mentioned Hornsdale Power Pack too. So the big thing the reason I originally wanted to talk to you was there's all this talk about climate change. And for those who don't know, Chris is, I mentioned this at the beginning, Chris is an atmospheric scientist. Years ago, probably 15 years ago, maybe longer, Chris gave a talk to a group. The group where we met is called the Schenectady Torch Club. And I'm going to put this up. So he talked about climate change, and basically he persuaded me. I didn't have a firm opinion before. I have a firm opinion now, and it's Chris's fault. But, we'll talk about that in a minute. But to get into the specifics, that I think this is along the lines of your thoughts, I'm going to put it up on screen. And Chris can't see this, by the way, for those who are watching. This is a new article that was just published by Bjorn Lomborg. Its title is Welfare in the 21st Century, Increasing Development, Reducing Inequality, the Impact of Climate Change, and the Cost of Climate Policies. Bjorn Lomborg is very well known in the environmental community. He's hated by environmentalists. I don't know if people can... I'm looking at my YouTube, but there's a delay, so I can't tell whether it's on or not. Yeah, it's on. Okay, it came on. So I'm going to take this down now, and then I'm going to put up next... this is some of the content of the article. And again, Chris can't see this, but he read it earlier. So, Chris, I'm just going to read to you bits of it, and then we'll talk about it. Lomborg said, arguments for devastation typically ignore adaptation. which will reduce vulnerability dramatically. While climate research suggests fewer but stronger future hurricanes will increase damages, this effect will be countered by richer and more resilient societies. Global cost of hurricanes will likely decline from 0.04% of GDP today to 0.02% of GDP in 2100. So just starting with that, Chris, arguments for devastation typically ignore adaptation. What do you think about humanity's ability to adapt to changes from climate change?
I think climate has always changed. We've always had weather disasters, and the trends over the 20th century are all in a down. The costs of weather-related disasters and stuff has dropped dramatically. The number of deaths, people dying in hurricanes. The deadliest hurricane on record was in the U.S. was Galveston, 1901 or something, I think, where I think something on the order of 10,000 people were wiped out when the whole city was flooded with a 20-foot storm surge that drowned the whole city, basically. Anyway, but what I'm Bjorn Lomborg is approaching the problem from an economic standpoint, and he's bringing out. See, there's no question that carbon dioxide could be contributed to climate change and could be contributing to things that are going to be costly down the line. But fossil fuel burning contributes to our standard of living, and like I said, every pound of carbon dioxide you produce is about $1 worth of wealth. And the social costs of carbon. There's a big debate among economists. How much, but it's in the range of on the order of $20, $30, $100 per ton. That's the costs that various people assign. But the social benefits of carbon are on the order of $1 per pound, which puts it in the $2,000 a pound, $2,000 a ton benefit range. So the benefits of carbon and fossil fuel use are a factor of 100 bigger than the costs in terms of if you just look at those numbers. And so I think Bjorn Lomborg is arguing along the lines that yes, today the environmental movement looks at the costs and they kind of have blinders on. They look at the bad news, but they don't look at the good news of carbon. And Bjorn brings that point home in his analysis that there's a lot of good stuff happening here, and we as a society have to weigh whether we want a higher standard of living and everybody living in houses and air conditioning and electricity throughout most of the third world. Or, do we want to trade that off with maybe a hurricane or more per year somewhere? How many hurricanes are we supposed to have? That's a cost-benefit trade-off, if it even is true.
Yeah, I think the Tesla fans like me, we are hopeful that whether you believe in climate change or not, if Tesla is able to deliver a low-cost, if we electrify transportation and people believe this will lower the consumption of fossil fuels and reduce CO2 emissions, we may get there while improving the standard of living.
No, I've always said in my talks that I've given, heck, I gave a talk just a month or two ago where they were very, Chris, you should not have given this talk. You have misinformed the public. Now, anyway, no, and I actually, Mike, and I realize now, I thought about that. All I showed was that the climate change that's happening is probably not as catastrophic as you've been told. And that's okay, but if you want to believe the worst, that's probably okay. But I immediately, the comeback I'm coming with is that I personally can think of many reasons to cut back on my fossil fuel emissions. And those reasons, climate change is just way down the list of my, the pollution alone from a smokestack of a coal-fired power plant, causes the haze and stinging eyes. I grew up in Los Angeles with really bad air pollution, and there are benefits to cutting fossil fuel use that have nothing to do with climate. And so anyway, I personally believe that reducing fossil fuel use, there are many other advantages to doing that, and it's perfectly appropriate for you to be pursuing that angle, that we're going to switch to this irrespective of climate change.
All right, let me see if there's anything else in here I wanted to ask you about from this article. You can't see this, and I can. Sorry about that. They said they came up with a number that long-term, that the Paris Agreement would cost somewhere between $1 trillion and $2 trillion a year in 2030, but would reduce emissions by just 1% of what is needed to limit average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and each dollar spent on Paris will likely produce climate benefits worth 11 cents. I think one of the key things I wanted to ask you about there was there's this notion that if we do the Paris Accord, if everybody goes along with the Paris Accord, how much will that reduce warming? And he's basically saying, well, this stuff isn't going to reduce warming much at all. What can you say about that?
Well, I would say the same thing I said when I first started giving my talks. The big accord at that time was the Kyoto Accord, which everybody was. It's what do you call that? Virtue signaling is what you're doing here. Everything I've seen about the Paris Accord is that there's really no. China, for example, is allowed to ramp up their CO2 emissions. Most of the developing world is allowed to maybe buy a car for every 3 or 4 people. They're allowing carbon emissions to rise over a huge fraction of the world's population. And there's no mention that, wait a minute, if carbon dioxide is a really horrible pollutant and every molecule that goes up there is causing polar bears to die, then we have to stop burning fossil fuels. And these changes that are being proposed are very minor. There are noise level changes that are being proposed. And I've always thought that, politicians, when you give them the chance to make a policy, if they actually implemented a policy that would cause carbon reductions, that's going to seriously impede standard of living. And it's okay. I got to admit, if you tell me, Chris, you're in a 3,000 square foot house, maybe you should move into a 1,000 square foot house. That makes sense. I can save money. But I don't think the average person wants to downsize, although that's how you have to think of it. And that paper very clearly shows that the world is on a trajectory of increasing our carbon footprint. And the Paris Accord maybe changes that by an extremely small amount. And if you project that change into the climate change that's going to happen from that, it's down there. Even if the world, one of the slides that I showed in my talk is if humanity was able to cut their carbon emissions by 50%, which would be, wow, that's a pretty dramatic. If we could do that, what you actually show is you only cut the warming from maybe 4 degrees to 3 degrees. That's with the 50% reduction in emissions. And that's going to be a huge hit on your standard of living. But anyway, even if the world only had 3 degrees of warming, I'm pretty sure all the doom climate catastrophe people would still be saying 3 degrees of warming is the end of the earth as we know it. And yet it's viewed as, 3 degrees is we've saved the world, 4 degrees is the end of the world. To me, there's warming. If warming is bad, it's bad no matter what. And
when I go over the top in the climate change argument, I like to suggest that if we were really concerned about it, we would nuke China, India, and Africa, and then they would stop emitting CO2, and we would, of course, because we're the good guys, we would cut our own CO2 emissions, and then we would, because what you really have to do is stop CO2 emissions, not cut 50%. You have to stop.
That's right.
Really, you'd have to start taking CO2 out of the atmosphere along with stop. I mean, maybe there would be some natural reduction over time by the environment processing the CO2 that's up there, but you really want to completely stop CO2 emissions, which means not heating your home in Schenectady, Latham, New York, and I wouldn't be able to air condition my house here in sunny Florida, and we wouldn't be able to drive anywhere, and life would be pretty miserable.
That's right. So that's the trade-off. Humanity's made the jump from a renewable energy society of 1850, where we all lived on hydropower and horse transportation, but our standard of living has gone up by an order of magnitude, and it's all due to the energy density of fossil fuels. It's an amazing. Another thing I've had friends tell me is that the people that are going to suffer from climate change are in the poor countries of the African Sahel region. And my comeback is that, if you want to help the poor African, you have to maybe drill wells. Okay, how do you drill wells to get water into this arid, dry region? If you drill those wells with fossil fuel, you're going to get 100 wells drilled. Yeah. If you drill the wells with Tesla powered, I guarantee you're only going to get 10 wells drilled. So it's just way more efficient to use a fossil fuel to raise your standard of living than to not use fossil fuels right now.
Right. And those of us who are Tesla fans can dream that somehow Tesla will innovate radically with solar and battery power and make it competitive with fossil fuels. But even Elon says, let's say with rockets are still going to have to be powered with something other than solar. You're not going
Right.
to launch 100 tons into orbit with solar power. So other than converting
Well,
let me just see if there was anything else in here. No, I think that was good. So I think we'll stop talking about that. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is we've been back and forth with some friends of ours on Facebook about COVID-19. And I was just curious for your thoughts. I don't think you and I have talked about it in the last couple of days. What are you seeing as the latest in the COVID-19 situation? What is your general impression of it? Where are we heading from here?
oh, I think this is going to be a transformative event in the annals of public health and human relationships even. I mean, I'm amazed at. Anyway, I just found the CDC website that listed weekly mortality, and what I thought was funny was, did you know that the world or the U.S. record for weekly deaths happened back in January of 2018, where we saw a spike in total mortality by about 10 to 15,000 deaths per week. And we never heard about it for some reason, and it's comparable to what we're seeing today, and in fact it's bigger than what we see today, but we never heard about this, and so my suspicion is back then in that very bad flu season, something was going around that was probably transmitted the same way this is transmitted. We didn't shut down the economy then, and to me there's a whole bunch of just unanswered questions here. I personally think that maybe outside of New York, maybe in New York, there's some good justification you could make for shutting down the economy. But outside of New York, I have family in California where overall mortality is not changing much at all, and yet they've shut down the entire economy, closed beaches, and done a bunch of stuff that they probably should have done that. So my theory on this going forward, or my thinking on this going forward, is that we probably should shut down the economy every 3 or 4 flu seasons for the exact same reason that we're shutting down the economy today. And I'm not sure that that's going to fly with people. I don't know. Maybe it will. There are a lot of people who genuinely believe that we should try to save lives, and you can quantify the lives delayed or the deaths delayed by doing these things. And anyway, it'll be real interesting to see how this unfolds and how society responds to and we're still going to feel much more of the negative impacts that are going to be kind of weird. I'm not sure where we're going.
It's interesting. I saw two very starkly different views on the impact. Because one of my impressions is a lot of the people who are dying are people who are, for lack of a better term, on their way out anyway. And there's a UK researcher named Neil Ferguson, who's sort of like the big voice in England. And at one point he said a half to 2/3 of the people who die from this would have died this year anyway. So that implies that it's, you don't want people to die earlier than they should necessarily, but then there's somebody else, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal in the last couple of days, some other researchers are saying that the average person who dies lost 10 years of life, that they died 10 years earlier than they would have. Well, those are two very, very different perspectives. And, a lot of what I'm seeing is that people who are most profoundly affected are people with chronic illnesses, people who, people in nursing homes. Well, I remember when they reported a COVID death, it was a woman in Utah who was in hospice, and she was in hospice before the virus. And when you go into hospice when you got 6 months to live, and she'd been in hospice
Right.
for a few months, so she was on her way out. The nursing home deaths, people who are in nursing homes don't usually have a very long time to live. My mother's in an assisted living facility, which is a step below nursing home. So do you have a sense, and I think it's almost like, isn't it in a sense too early to have reliable data? There's just so much crazy data flying around out there, we don't know what's going on yet.
Well, I've seen the number that I always thought you have to. No, this controversy came up with, if you remember when Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, the day or the week the hurricane struck, there were, lives lost in the range of 10 to 100 range. And then of course, Harvard came up with a study a year later saying 3,000 people died. And they do that by comparing mortality. They look at at the the weekly, monthly, annual deaths. And so you're right. Suppose if someone dies 10 years before they were quote supposed to die, that should show up in mortality statistics. But it's going to take you 10 years to measure that effect. You're going to see that, hey, Joe Smith should have died in 2030, and he died today. And so only in 2030 are we going to maybe see, my God, there's fewer people dying now. So you're going to see these funny effects that are going to take a long time to actually measure. But all I know is when I look, for example, at deaths in California, right now, COVID deaths are on the, in the state of California, I think I did the calculation right here, about 700 people die per day in that state every day. Okay, that's just the normal, and it goes up by 10%, goes an additional 70 a day. Right now, the deaths in California, averaged over the last month, are about the COVID deaths are being reported as about 3% of that 700 figure. They're down there in the level where, now, to me, when you actually look at, well, are there 3%, are there 700 plus 3% more dying today? And no, there's actually not. There's a lot of people that would have been dying anyway that because they tested positive for COVID or because they had a fever when they died, they're being counted as a COVID death. But right now, if you look at just the weekly death mortality coming out of California in the last month, it's almost like you don't see anything in that meter of how devastating this is to public health.
Now, the other side of that is there are people who are dying because they're not getting the care that they might need because they're afraid to go to the hospital, they're afraid to go to their doctor's office. And I saw something about people dying of heart disease because they didn't get a procedure done because they were afraid to go to the hospital. And that there's an increase in those deaths. So it's really going to be hard to suss out which deaths are the result of the virus versus which deaths are the result of the shutdowns or the fear. You know what I'm saying? What do you think?
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
But I think even then, if you subject that to the scientific methodology there, if something is increasing, that should show up in death certificates that are filed with your counties and your states and to the CDC. So we should see that showing up. And we are seeing it in New York. There's no question. By the way, the Spanish flu of 1918, what's amazing there is the death rate, the weekly death rate went up by a factor of 6. Okay, so, now, again, today in New York, I think the total death rate is in the 400-something per day is the quote, normal death rate time. And right now, I think we've seen that number in New York, the weekly toll, about double. So we're seeing 800 people a day over the last month. That's a doubling. But if this were the Spanish flu of 1918, we would have seen something like 4 times. We would have seen 2,600 people dying per day. And so this is mild compared to the 1918 Spanish flu. But it is significant in New York. But in a lot of places outside of New York, it's harder to find that signal.
There's another view in New York, and this is one article, so I don't know how reliable it is, but there's apparently the state ordered nursing homes in New York to take in COVID patients and threatened them with prosecution if they discriminated against COVID patients. This was in New York Post, Daily News, something like that, that there was an order from the health department ordering nursing homes to take COVID patients in. And so that's the last place you want a COVID patient.
Well, no, but that's all. I view that as that's the fog of war here. This is an unprecedented thing in New York. It definitely is a big thing going on here, and I could fully understand a lot of confusion. And you're right. It reminds me of there's a couple of Michael Crichton movies, Andromeda Strain. I remember that one where people have something really dangerous and really bad. Do you want them near you? What are you doing? Are you sympathetic to them? Do you try to help them? Do you stay away from them? Anyway, I can kind of understand confusion. This is a new thing,
right.
and
all right. Well, thank you, Chris. It's great talking to you. For those who don't know, Chris and I have known each other a long time. We haven't talked in quite a long time in person, or even in video chat like this. We've been commenting on Facebook back and forth. It's great to see you. I keep seeing we post pictures of our families, and I see pictures of your family. I assume you see pictures of mine, and I'm glad to see you're doing well. And
same here, Warren. Same here.
Best wishes to you and your family. Thank you for coming on my YouTube channel.
It's been a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
We'll
Thanks.
See you on Facebook soon.
Okay, bye.
So we're still on. We're not on live.
We're not
I just.
okay. Yeah, well, that was.
What'd you think?
Oh, it was cute. It reminds me of some of these. Like I watch Candace Owens' show once in a while, where she interviews people, and I've always anyway that it felt a little bit like I was on something like that, and then my experience right now is tainted a little bit by this studio shooting session that I had 6 months ago, where you know. You had me talking extemporaneously, which is I don't know if I'm good at that or not.